Hi, I'm James Robinson, and this is my stock pick of the week. This is part 2 in my 5-part series on the company's Standard Motor Products, symbol SMP. Today we're going to talk about the company's operations. As you watch this video, you're going to see that the operations of this company are really nothing special. They're not bad, they're not horrible, certainly, but they're average at best. That is in large part due to the kind of business they are. They're an old line manufacturer. They're making, these engine parts, oftentimes obscure engine parts, not in huge batches because they're not making them for the manufacturer. They're making them for the repair market, right? So they're selling things to Napa. They're not selling things to Ford. And the result is that they don't have these gigantic batches. So it's harder for them to get economies of scale. Therefore, it's harder for them to get, sort of the big gross margins that I like and other economies of scale. That shouldn't be a reason not to buy the company. Its debt is zero, or effectively zero. The company does a good job with dividends. They buy back some stock. They've done a good job using retained earnings to buy new companies that are throwing off earnings. So the company's a solid company, but as I go through this operations department section of the thing, you're going to see that it's not spectacular. No company is perfect. Every company has things they do well and things they do badly. It's what we look at in the aggregate that matters. The first thing that I look at when analyzing a company, believe it or not, is gross margins. I don't look at anything before that. And the reason that I do that is I think gross margins are really, really important. It's something that would cause me to instantly stop looking at a company if I didn't like the gross margins. The reason that I like gross margins is because I look at it as a pilot, I look at that as sort of altitude. When you're flying a plane and you're at 1,000 feet and something goes wrong, you're going to crash. If you're at 12,000 feet and something goes wrong, we have lots of time to find someplace safe to land. Margins are the same thing. If you've got razor thin margins and anything goes wrong with your business, you will drop down into losses and not make money. If on the other end you have really high margins, then if something goes wrong and cuts your margins to some degree, you're still likely to continue making money. Also, margins are a measure of pricing power, right? If you're able to charge really high margins, that means that what you can charge in revenue relative to your costs are high, and that's a good sign that your company has sort of a monopoly, or a consumer monopoly, which is what Warren Buffett looks at. So the thinner the margins, the less exciting a company generally is. So when you look at this company, you'll see that desirable gross margins for me are about 40%. This company's gross margins are about 30%. So they're not at the point that I'm instantly excited. Any company with margins less than 20% I won't consider at all. So they're sort of halfway between undesirable and something really, really sexy. But that's still within the range of the company being average or adequate. And because of that, I continue to look for other facets of the company. The next thing that I look at is earnings and earnings per share. You can see that both of those have basically been kind of flat since 2011. They've gone up a little bit, they've gone down a little. They're in a relatively narrow margin. That is obviously not that exciting. However, the company pays a decent dividend. They buy back some shares, not a lot, but they buy back some shares. And more importantly, I believe that they continue to buy these additional companies that expand their reach, give them better economies of scale. I think this company is going to begin to increase their profits. I think that even if they keep their profits exactly where they are, we're buying this company at 13 times earnings. And we can do well with companies who buy at 13 times earnings with stable income. But again, this is not something I look at this and go, wow, this company's earnings going straight up to the moon. But if they were doing that, we wouldn't be buying it at 13 times earnings. So you take the good with the bad. The company looks like it's not going to have any issues of losing money, and it's going to print money. It's just not going to print ever more money every year, I don't think. So I'm looking at this in these two slides, and what we're looking at is on the left, we have net earnings as a percentage of revenue. And you can see that this company is, kind of right in the middle. The purple line is the top 25% of companies. The orange line is the bottom 25% of companies. And this company is almost exactly in the middle, and it has been since 2011. So again, it's an average company in terms of that. But the good news is that number is very, very constant. And despite the fact that it's constant, you see that the revenues have been increasing basically every year since 2008. So if we're getting the same amount of net earnings as a percentage of revenue over time, and that revenue is growing over time, and since 2009, it's gone from, call it 800 million to 1.2 billion, That's basically a 50% increase in 10 years. Let's assume we get the same rate of return, same earnings as a percentage of revenue over that period of time. You see that the earnings are going up gradually over that period of time. And so if we get this company at 13 times earnings, which means we're getting a good return, we're getting a nice dividend, and gradually those earnings go up over time, and we're not paying anything extra for those earnings, and especially when they buy back some shares and pay us some dividends, over the long run, I think this company is a solid earner for us. One of the things that I kind of look at when I analyze a company is how efficient a job they do, or how their industry is set up in terms of what I call these 4 taxes. So there are a number of things that every business has to spend money on as operating costs to some degree. And the question is, how much are those costs chewing into the gross profits? So if you think about it, we have revenue, that's the amount of money that comes in the door. We have cost of goods sold. That's what it costs to simply manufacture the products you're selling. What's left is gross income or gross profit. And that gross profit is to some extent discretionary. The company can decide how to allocate those funds to best run their business. Some companies have to spend a bunch of that money on research and development. Some companies have to spend a bunch of that money on inventory. And how a company spends that money can often dictate the quality of the company and the quality of the earnings. So we look at these, I call these the 4 taxes. They're not really taxes, but they're 4 expenses. Selling and general administrative, plants and equipment, inventories, and research and development. So looking at this slide, you can see the selling and general administrative as a percentage of gross profits has been gradually decreasing since 2008. In 2008, this company was in the bottom 10% of companies in terms of sales as a percentage of selling and general administrative as a percentage of gross profits. But that number has come down gradually. They're now better than the bottom 25% of companies. I know that's not exciting, but some companies do have to spend more money on selling and general administrative than others. And this is one of those industries that has to do that. This number, however, has been coming down, and I believe it will continue to come down. This company has been doing bolt-on acquisitions year after year after year, small companies, which increase the number of products and increase their reach and make them, every time a salesman walks into a store, he's got another product to sell, another revenue stream at the same cost to the salesman. So I think the selling and general administrative, plus there's economies of scale as you own more and more businesses and more niches. So I believe that the selling and general administrative costs for this company would gradually continue to come down. I don't think it'll ever be great. It'll never be the kind of thing where you go, this is a great company, because the selling and general administrative is 0. But it is becoming more and more interesting in that component. The next thing, plants and equipment. Plants and equipment as a percentage of assets have been very, very level. The company is close to the top 25% of companies. Again, that's pretty impressive when you consider that this is a heavy-duty manufacturer. Right? They make lots and lots of different things in lots of different factories. Another thing that you should keep in mind that's very interesting is that they own a tremendous amount of properties. I'm going to talk about that in the balance sheet section, but they own a bunch of real estate and they have no debt. So there's a whole asset base there that's probably undervalued, almost certainly undervalued, because their space is industrial space. And as a guy who does commercial real estate for a living, I can tell you that the value of industrial space is going through the roof. So if they were to liquidate this business and sell all their real estate, I think we do very, very well on those assets. So long story short, plants and equipment is pretty good for this company. Selling and general administrative is below average, but it seems to be improving. So the next 2 issues are research and development. Let me talk about R&D first. This company spends virtually nothing in R&D. This is a little bit of a misnomer. This company actually does spend money in R&D. For some reason, they're not calling it R&D. It's not showing up on their income statement as such. But I do, when you look at the annual report and you read about the company, they talk about the things that they're trying to do to improve the quality of their products over time. So I'm not sure why it's not showing up, but for the purposes of this analysis, the company's R&D is 0. That's really good. Obviously, it's as good as it can get. Inventories. This company's inventories are very, very high. They're worse than the bottom 10% of companies. Again, that's a little bit of a misnomer. When you're a company that makes software, you have no inventory because software is obviously piped out over time. When you're a company that sells goods and services, again, you have no inventory because your inventory is just people coming to work every day and doing their job. So if you're a manufacturer like this company is, you're automatically at a massive disadvantage versus the other 1,000 companies that I might have looked at. The issue here is that inventory as a percentage of revenues the problem has been that it has been increasing since 2009. So they're holding more and more inventory for every dollar of sales. I don't like that. I'd like to see that trend continue. It's not the kind of thing that would make me disinterested in a company, but it's the kind of thing that I like to be aware of. The good news is that from 2019 to 2020, it did drop, but I'm not sure how much of that was the result of COVID. A lot of the companies I'm looking at are having weird numbers in 2020, and to a large extent, I'm simply, not paying much attention to what happened in 2020 because COVID has really screwed up a lot of companies. So that's it for the R&D and the inventory. Inventory not so great, R&D great. Let's call that a wash between the two. The final section here is interest expense as a percentage of operating income. Now, interest expense isn't really a tax in that it's voluntary, right? You've set yourself up in this position to have to pay debt and therefore of taking on debt and therefore having to pay interest expense. Here, the interest expense is virtually zero. I mean, I get nervous when a company is spending more than 15% of its operating income on debt. This company has only approached that 1 year. Currently, they're spending less than 2% or less than 3% of that money on interest payments. So it's really a non-issue. It's actually a strength of this company that their interest payments are so low as a section of interest expense. So when you look at this company, obviously nothing stands out in terms of operations that says, hey, let's buy this company. If anything, you would say, let's maybe pass on this company. However, again, when we look at the wealth creation, we look at the dividends, and we look at the balance sheet for this company, I think that those three sections say buy the company strongly enough that we will give the company a pass on its operations, because I believe the operations are stable. I believe they're predictable. I believe we sort of can continue to assume the company's going to do like it's doing. But in summary, I look for companies with margins of at least 40%. This company's margins are about 29%, so they're below the super desirable section, but the minimum gross margins I look for are 20%, and it's above that. Profits have bounced around, but in a very narrow range for 10 years. The company's average, income as a percentage of revenues have been increasing, and the company's percentage of revenue that generate earnings are consistent, and that means over time the company should generate a little bit more profit. Selling and general administrative and plants and equipment as a percentage of assets have been average to below average for the last 10 years. Obviously, that's not great. Plants and equipment is offset by the fact that we own a bunch of stuff, and I think that is unrealized value on the balance sheet. R&D is zero, so obviously that's great. Interest payments also are basically zero. That's great. Those two things are sort of a 10. When you look at it, the plants and equipment as a function of assets as opposed to expense is probably a 10. R&D is probably a 10. Interest payments are probably a 10, and that offsets some of the other things that are closer to 5s. Again, it's an old line manufacturer, and it's not selling huge volumes of products, so it's hard for them to get economies of scale, and their inventories and selling general administrative are going to be out of whack as a result of that industry. But again, it's very, very stable. And so generally speaking, the operations for Standard Motor Products are solid, but not great, but they're good enough that we can continue to look at the other facets of the business. Thanks for your time.